Okay, well, welcome everybody to the second presentation. So I'm very happy to present to you one of our international applicants coming from Edinburgh, Scotland. Right, but that's okay. Who also happens to be an alma mater for several of the faculty here. So earned a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology at McGill, Masters of Social Work at the University of Sussex, and a Master of Science by Research Social Work. And that's at the University of Edinburgh, both of them coming with dissertations. So it's always nice to see as well. International Visiting Research Trainee. Then finally a PhD of Social Work at the University of Edinburgh as well. So Sarah Golightley. Yes. Pronounced right?
Yes, thank you so much.
And I'll let you do the rest of the introduction.
Great, thank you.
Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. It's really exciting to be here. It is my first time in St. John's, but I've heard really good things about it. My PhD supervisor is from here. He's always talked about it as like this really unique and kind of magical place. So today I'm going to talk to you about the troubled teen industry in the United States. It's what I did my doctoral research on. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to the discussion afterwards. So just to, there we go. Just as a bit of an introduction to the research, I am a survivor of the troubled teen industry, a former student of what we call a therapeutic boarding school. And I wanted to do this research because for a long time, like until recently, much of what was known about the troubled teen industry was professional led. So the studies were conducted by or with professionals. Much of the news coverage was sympathetic to professionals and not so much to the perspectives of students, or at least not to critical students. So I felt like there was a really important story that wasn't being told. The research that existed didn't reflect my experiences or the experiences that I was witnessing when I was there. So yeah, what I decided to do, because there was so little research in the area, I conducted an online questionnaire to try and find people who'd be interested in talking about the subject. And then I followed that up with in-depth interviews. And then from there, I made case studies and I collaborated with case study participants around the world. And please interrupt me if you have any questions. I'm out to explain what the troubled teen industry is. So the troubled teen industry, there's some debate about how to define it, but I've considered it to be residential behavior modification programs that seek to reform psychiatrized youth. And by psychiatrized youth, I mean young people who are labeled with mental health, behavioral issues, and substance misuse issues. And I say labeled as opposed to like an actual, so to speak, diagnosis in some ways, because you don't actually need to be diagnosed. You just need to be considered to be out of line in some way. Some people are diagnosed with mental health problems in some way. So these are private and under-regulated treatment facilities. So some employ social workers and mental health professionals, and some do not. So sometimes they're led by faith leaders, and this is almost always Christian. And some are referred to as like ex-addicts, so former substance misuse users. So yeah, the troubled teen industry is kind of like a broad term. It includes therapeutic boarding schools, which I'll go into more in a second. Something called wilderness therapy. Some of you might have heard of it. Not all wilderness therapy is quite like what you might come across as I'm talking, and I believe that there's something that happens in British Columbia that, as far as I'm aware, is better, I hope. There's some good people who do work on it over there. It can also include boot camps and something called residential treatment centers. They're not always fully distinct from each other as categories, and they're related. So a lot of people will go to wilderness therapy before they go to a therapeutic boarding school. Or if you're at a therapeutic boarding school and you're breaking too many rules, they might ship you off to wilderness therapy and then you come back. So wilderness therapy in the troubled teen industry sense are places where they're sending young people under 18, sometimes as young as like 11 or 12, but usually teenagers. And you are literally in the woods or the desert, and you're hiking all day, and you have to cook your own meals, make your own fireplace. And then there's like very intensive, like group. We could call it counseling. I think it's a debatable term there. And there's widespread reports of abuse and maltreatment within these. I consider them to be what Goffman would call total institutions. So while you're inside of these programs, you can't really get off campus, or if you're in the wilderness, you can't escape. Like when I say wilderness, I mean really in the wilderness. You couldn't really run away if you tried to. You definitely don't have a cell phone, but even if you did, you wouldn't get reception. On therapeutic boarding school campuses, most of them are relatively rural. Not located in cities, probably doesn't have a bus connection. Again, it's quite difficult to run away, and you're being removed in most instances quite far from where a young person's grown up. People often go out of state to these programs. So as I was saying about them being private facilities, parents often pay the program fees, and that's quite important in terms of regulatory oversight. Depending on what state it's in, if it's privately funded, the government has very little input in it. There might not be any independent inspections, for example, and the requirement for social workers may not exist. However, not all of them are done this way. There are ways that people get funding from the government through what's called IDEA. So it's like a disability educational funds if people apply as mental health problems. And in some instances, there are private facilities where placements are procured through the state. So for example, foster care youth can be placed in a therapeutic boarding school. So young people can be sent by their parents with or without their consent. A young person does not have to agree to go, although some of the schools have different policies around this. If they're a private program, no independent evaluation is necessary, and there's no diagnosis needed. Again, it does vary depending on the program itself. Quite disturbingly, some young people are not only sent away, they are forcibly taken. So there's this whole kind of underground industry called youth transportation services. And again, they don't have to have any qualifications, don't necessarily have to have a criminal record check, although some organizations do require that. Basically, they like hire a couple of people to come in the middle of the night, wake up a young person and say, like, you're coming with me or not, or you're like, you can cooperate or not, but either way, you're coming with us. And if people resist, they can be like manhandled and put in a van and everything. So survivors of this often called, it's known as like goons or gooning. I call it authorized kidnapping.
Sorry, you mentioned that it's okay to have an interruption question?
Yes, please.
So consent treatment. So in the States, then there's no sort of legislation. I mean, I get it. They're in the middle of nowhere. Consent or not, they're stranded, right? But is there no such thing as consent to treatment, like an age consent to treatment in the States? Or?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I did touch on it a little bit, but I can go to it now. It depends on the state, and it depends on how like the private versus public, there's different obligations. So in the US, it's in some ways kind of unique. There is a very strong emphasis on parents' rights over children's rights. Depends a bit on the state. But parents generally do have the right to send a child to these places, partially because they're not necessarily registered as mental health facilities. So you're sending them to a boarding school, not to a psychiatric unit. So it is able, and that's part of how these kind of like titles shift, is they don't have to follow the same rules and regulations of a psychiatric unit, because that's not what this is, even though it's acting in some ways as if it were one. That's also how they can have, you know, not necessarily have social workers or counselors who are qualified, because these are on paper, they're just schools. Yep.
And Fred, I was supposed to pick you up this morning. In the obscure part of town, this new hotel with all the construction, right?
Yeah.
So I went by, was immediately caught up in the construction.
Yeah.
Found myself going out to Harbor Arterial, and there's no way of turning around. So I had to go all the way to Mount Pearl and come back. Come back downtown, and by then we were gone.
Oh, I'm sorry. Yeah.
So, I'm a survivor of residential schools here in Canada, and this sounds strikingly like it.
Yes.
An author here in Canada, he lives in New Brunswick, a man called Roland Christian, Dr. Roland Christian, refers to that experience as genocide.
Mm-hmm.
You use that kind of language?
That's a really good question. I refer to it as torture. I think that there is an argument that it could be considered to be a form of eugenics for people who have mental health problems and are neurodivergent. But I think that there's a lot in common with residential schools. I think an important difference is that it's not being carried out with the cultural genocidal intent behind residential schools for Indigenous folk. So this isn't taking, it is forcing a particular kind of culture onto people, because the expectation is that you will be gender conforming, kind of preppy. A lot of the schools are like Mormon run. So there's kind of an expectation that if you're like healed and healthy and whole, that you will be of a kind of like particular type of person, and a white person, really, an upper class. So I think there is a good amount of overlap there. But I think there is a really important difference in terms of that cultural genocide. But there are Native American people who are sent to these programs as well.
Well, it certainly seems similar.
Yeah. Well, I mean, we can get into a whole conversation because I am actually really interested in the history.
Mm-hmm.
But certainly I think a lot of where the tactics come from are from these kind of original basis that was used in residential schools as well as other places, which is this kind of like blank slate approach. So often known in the troubled teen industry as like break them down to build them back up. Brainwashing. But it's this idea that you can, I think at one point it was considered progressive, that everybody was equal and that everybody could be built into whatever image you wanted. And I think from the perspective of helpers, so to speak, that might be what they believe is happening. I think others have a much more sinister intent, but I think a lot of people are going into it thinking, you know, we're saving people's lives. They would be these kind of like trash kids, and we're going to turn them into these upstanding citizens. So I think that some of that kind of like that total institution, that like forced obedience, the cultural imposition, there's certainly a lot. And And it's not just a coincidence, these are coming from.
Goffman was onto it.
Yeah. It fits very well with this research. Are there any other questions? Yeah, so the other thing that is relatively, well, is definitely unique to the US is the UN Declaration of Rights of the Child was never ratified by the US. Neither was one on disability. So there's a lack of oversight. We really do not know much about this industry. It's all in an academic sense. We don't know how many programs are currently in operation. We don't know how many there have been. We don't know who they employ, who they admit, what style of therapeutic intervention they use, or what the long-term outcomes are. Which is quite something considering this is like a multi-million-dollar industry that's been going on for decades. But one of the problems is that oversight is complicated by legal variations in each state and a lack of definitional consistency. So in one state, what might be considered a therapeutic boarding school might in another be registered as a residential treatment center. And a wilderness therapy program might just be a camp. So that makes it very difficult. And in some states like Florida and Texas, faith-based programs are exempt almost entirely from government oversight because of the separation of church and state principle. It also gets a bit complicated, and I can go into it more if you're interested. But there's a powerful lobbying industry, and because they've set up in these rural communities, it's a major financial, it's of significant financial importance to these areas, and they pay a lot of taxes. But there's politicians and all sorts who have been involved in and profited from the industry. So in terms of the psychiatrization of youth, like who is sent to these places, young people can be sent for a whole host of reasons. Pretty much anyone can send their kid to a program if they wanted to and they can afford to. But for some people, there are really serious, complex mental health problems. So people have multiple suicide attempts. Sometimes people are aggressive. Their parents might be scared that they're going to hurt someone. Drug overdoses, things like this. So there are often really severe issues that the current landscape of care isn't able to fill, particularly in terms of long-term support. But others are sent for just kind of general teenage rebellion, walking back to their parents, skipping school, got caught smoking pot. Some people are sent for being LGBTQ. And also like cisgender heterosexual people, if they're considered to be promiscuous, which is almost only women, who get categorized in that way. So this is a screenshot from one of the websites. I didn't bold those. So this is just some examples that they've given. Entitlement. I don't think I've ever met a teenager who wasn't entitled. Defiance. Again, that's pretty normal. Rage, anger, cell phone addiction. There's a lot of terminology of addiction. So being addicted to your cell phone, being addicted to video games, being addicted to sex. They kind of impose an AA model on these sorts of things. So things like this. Again, some of them you could consider to be more serious, but who doesn't refuse to do chores?
So in other words, just for being around.
Just for being an inconvenience to the adults around them. Yeah, I would consider it to be anybody who isn't meeting the expectations of the parents and other adults.
Social work exists.
Yeah.
I feel like we have really psychiatrized behavior to the nth degree.
Mhm.
And it's getting so bad. People are being mislabeled, over-labeled, multiple labels, all those kinds of things. Like, it is really concerning.
Mhm.
Are you seeing, or have you seen in your research a real onslaught of children and youth being sent to these places as a result of that
Yeah.
psychiatrizing everybody?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's kind of hard to know in terms of the broader patterns because we have so little research. I would say that I think it's become increasingly medicalized. Um, Depends a little bit on where you are. So we are seeing more people now who have been diagnosed with a mental health problem or learning disability, often both. So there is a bit more of that. But I would say, and I'll talk about it in a little bit, but I do think the addiction framework is coming out more than it has been, and that it's one of the ways that people are kind of slipping in some more. I'll talk about conversion therapy, but part of what I've found in my research is that conversion therapy is taking place under the guise of sex addiction. Regardless of if somebody's having sex or not, it's considered to be like compulsive behavior that one should control in the way that you might if you applied AA to like substance misuse issues. So abstinence and yeah, just trying to like suppress everything basically. But because conversion therapy has been banned in a number of states, I would say that it's gone out, kind of out of fashion, so to speak, no longer as trendy with parents who are the clients here. The children are kind of the product sent to be fixed. I think given this kind of major rise of the right wing in the US, and particularly the influence of evangelical Christians in the US, the taboo of practicing conversion therapy is not as strong as it maybe was 4 or 5 years ago. Yep.
So, on my journey, one of the places I landed was a place called Emmanuel House, which is a treatment center primarily for survivors of child sexual abuse. You know, what we found, almost my decade working there with social workers, what we found was that psychiatrists got to what were to be our clients before we did a lot of the time. Because if you're a survivor of trauma like that, chances are you're going to act out. Acting out lands you in a hospital. Psychiatry shows up with medication, drugs you.
Yeah.
And you can't work with trauma issues when you got the Prozac staring back at you, right? It just doesn't work. You need to get to the feelings.
Yeah, I mean, I think that really depends on who the person is in terms of medications. I do think that for some people it can help folk to cope with really extreme emotional states. But one of the issues you have, particularly with children in residential care, is there's very little choice in the matter. And if they are having negative reactions to it, it's often dismissed. So there's a very like serious and concerning side to that. But I also wouldn't dismiss that some people do find that helpful. But yeah, a lot of the people who I've spoken to had, I would say these are issues, but some of them aren't even issues. A lot of the mental health struggles were coming from having been sexually abused in childhood. But a lot of them didn't tell anybody about it, or at least didn't tell the adults about it. So they went into these programs with that experience, but not necessarily with that as a known experience by others. And in some circumstances, not even really known and realized by themselves, like in terms of understanding what they've been through. So yeah, a lot of this like acting out is people coping with having experienced horrific things. And sometimes the parents who are sending their children away are parents who themselves have been abusive.
Are you sure you're not letting psychiatrists get away?
I mean, I have a lot of issues with psychiatry. Don't worry about that. Yeah, I guess I try to level with people and where they're at. And I don't think it's fair for me to say what helps someone else to survive. And I would rather someone be alive and coping than not be. And I do think that medication, my argument is that I think it could be an assistive technology if the power dynamics were different. And that's a major if that we're clearly very, very far away from. So I wouldn't say that that's where it currently is, but I think if we had a system that wasn't so top down, and research around medication was done in a different way, I think that you could have something there that's really powerful. And for some people it won't work, and for some people it might. So yeah, I just try to take people at their word to some extent, but I also appreciate that this comes up in my research as well. It's sometimes difficult for people to be fully cognizant of what's going on when they're in such a state of like trauma overwhelm. And I think while you're institutionalized, it's quite difficult to truly consent to anything because the power dynamics are so entrenched. And particularly for these teenagers, because a lot of them won't be able to get out unless they're allowed out, most of them. So you're in a situation where you have to comply, or at least be seen to be complying. And for, I would say my research is about 50-50 split people who kind of like internalize the messaging and then decide that they, well, not decide, they learn to comply and believe in the system. And you know, I talk to people who are like, I thought it was the best place in the world and that they'd saved my life. And then 10 years later are kind of like in a state of reckoning and unpicking that. And then there's a lot of people who just pretend that they believe and go through the motions, use the therapeutic language in order to get out. Because the more you resist, the more punishment you experience. And in some of these facilities, that's really extreme. Like people are put into like solitary confinement and things like that. So there are some people who run away, and parents can decide to pull a child out. Sometimes you can leave when you're 18, but they make it quite difficult. Like they can refuse to give you a high school diploma and tell your parents to cut you off financially and things like that. So some people actually stay until they're 19.
It didn't work for Jack Nicholson.
Yeah, well, I guess it depends on what it means by work, but they made me they made me pretty fiery. Yeah, maybe if you want, we can have a conversation rather than me stand up here with some slides. I did want to talk about something that I think is quite important, which is the industry has a kind of like public public image is of these like white upper class teenagers and former students, survivors. And I think there's various reasons for that. So I think in general, it is true that Black, Indigenous, and people of color are underrepresented in the troubled teen industry. And I think one of the reasons for that is that racialized people are more likely to be sent through the criminal justice system. So where a white middle class teenager is dealing pot, the Black teenager in the inner city goes to prison, that the white teenager goes to a therapeutic boarding school. So I think in that sense, a lot of people, racialized people, are filtered into the criminal justice system. But I would also argue that they're filtered out of the troubled teen industry because therapeutic boarding schools can cost up to $100,000 a year, sometimes more. And they often specifically target and recruit from like wealthy suburban locations. As I said, not everybody actually pays that, There are people who get state funding. I got a scholarship somehow. So there are different ways that people are able to afford it. But for a lot of people, it's also unaffordable. Like I interviewed people who, like, their family put their whole mortgage through, and they've got like a lifetime of debt, can't afford to go to university, and the like financial repercussions are really serious. So I find it frustrating when people depict it as something that only impacts upper class people, because that's just clearly not true. And around half of the people in my research were middle class, and a small number of people were from low income backgrounds. That also brings me to, I think there's a representational bias. A lot of troubled teen industry research and coverage focuses on parent pay programs, which are the ones that I've mostly been describing. But there is a different demographic if you look at private programs where most of the students are state procured. So those are much more likely to be people from racialized and low income backgrounds. And some of that goes back to debates about how to define it. Even though my research has quite a low number of people from low income backgrounds, and I think around 10% identified as people of color, that's actually more than other troubled teen industry researchers, of which there are like 4. But part of that is because I didn't limit it to parent pay programs. There are reasons why people argue that it should be limited to them, and partially that's because of the unique kind of legislative exceptionalism of private programs. As soon as there's any state funding that goes into a residential program, there has to be some accountability to the state. How extensive that is another issue, and usually it's pretty weak, but there's quite a unique circumstance for private pay programs. But the other issue, I think, is that people with the wealth and the power are more likely to be heard, right? Like they're more likely to be seen on Twitter, they're more likely to go viral on TikTok. You know, if anybody has heard about Paris Hilton was sent to one of these programs and it came out, she talked about it in one of her documentaries, and she's gotten a lot of news coverage from that. So now kind of people think Paris Hilton, and so it really reinforces this, like, that is some extreme wealth right there. But she's able to speak partially because of that wealth. You know, she is, if a therapeutic boarding school tries to sue her, she's got the means to resist that. Whereas other people have had to like take down their websites and stuff because of threats of lawsuits. So yeah, I think there's also an interesting debate about gender. Some people believe that there's actually more men who are sent, or boys who are sent to therapeutic boarding schools than women. But you're much more likely to hear women represented in the press, arguably because they might be more likely to talk about it. But again, it's really hard to know. Some programs are for boys only and some for girls only. So it's a bit tricky. Anecdotally, people think that it's more likely that men or boys are more likely. So yeah, the representation that we have right now is poor quality, and we don't really know exactly what's going on. And that's one of the like major issues that we see with this industry. Do you have any questions for that? Would you rather have a conversation rather than just going through slides?
I think everybody stuck about you.
Okay. Yeah, so I'll just check the same. So yeah, the therapeutic boarding schools, this is an image of one, I believe it's in Montana. But these private reform schools that combine therapy, group peer sessions, and education. Although education quality really varies. And some of it is just like self-study, sticks and things. But they can also be advertised as emotional growth boarding schools, as ranches, military academies, etc. So I tested this briefly in terms of my research. So this online questionnaire that was open to anyone, I promoted it mostly over social media. I didn't have to do very much, it spread very quickly. And I got over 100 participants in a relatively short amount of time. This was in like 2018 and 2019, so it's before the Paris Hilton documentary came out. Everything except for the case study stage was all before the Paris Hilton documentary came out, which is actually important because people rarely heard these stories being told. So for a lot of the times in the, sorry, I'll go back. So I did this online questionnaire and a subsample which I invited to interview. I traveled around to different parts of the US so that I could do as many of them in person as possible. The sampling process, I tried to like boost representation of people from lower income backgrounds and racialized people. But I can talk a bit more about that as well. It also had to do with where I was able to travel to. And then after doing the interviews and some of the provisional analysis, I wrote case studies on around half of the interview participants and invited them to give feedback and collaborate in that writing process and fact check it. And yeah, everyone except for one person engaged in that stage, which was also a really useful way of writing about it and hearing what people's thoughts are. Yeah. So I've talked about this a little bit already in terms of the definition of trouble. How do we define the industry and who gets represented in the ways that we currently define it? Yeah, so until relatively recently, it has been considered majority white, sometimes exclusively white. And unfortunately, a lot of the people who have died in these programs recently have been people of color. So this is someone named Cornelius Frederick, who died after a dangerous restraint in one of the facilities in 2020. But if you try to find an interview with a Black survivor of the industry in the media, probably won't find it. So just kind of going back to the institutional violence and the ways that these programs operate from what I found in my research. The programs have a regimen of strict rules, often referred to as attack therapy or peer confrontation, peer surveillance and punishments. In addition, as I said earlier, they're in these remote locations where people are isolated from their friends, families, and communities. And there are these widespread reports of abuse, including verbal, physical, sexual, nutritional deprivation, sleep deprivation, seclusion and restraint, and censored contact with everyone on the outside, and medical neglect. So a little bit about attack therapy. It's quite disturbing, so I won't go into too much detail, but it's also known as compassionate confrontation therapy. And the idea is that you would sit in a group, in a circle, and you would have to confront each other. It's mandated that you have to confront each other. The staff will do it, but the peers also have to. And the idea is that through this group pressure, there will be some sort of emotional catharsis. So people will scream and all sorts of things. From my research, a lot of people fake it, they just make it up. They pretend that they've gone through things that they haven't in order to be seen as making like these kind of emotional breakthroughs. It's supposed to encourage accountability. So you're supposed to be, on paper at least, you're supposed to be holding each other accountable for all the things that you've done wrong. It's very shame-based. So it's purposefully shaming and undermining. It's a very violent experience. And it goes back to what I was kind of saying earlier about this break them down to build them back up approach. So the idea is that you kind of like collapse under all of that pressure. And then you're more malleable after having a kind of like psychological collapse. And there's these really strict talk about like psychiatrizing folk. Even the way that you sit is regulated, and if you're not sitting the proper way, you can be like called out for it. And there's various kind of like terminology that programs will use in relation to this. Not all programs use that, but quite a lot, perhaps less so now than there used to be. Another major component of it is peer surveillance. So peers are instructed to monitor each other. So kind of relating back to the these kind of group sessions, if you've seen something that someone's done to break the rules, you're supposed to confront them about it. But oftentimes people would make it up, because if you're being kind of sometimes referred to as like in the hot seat. So if you're the one in the hot seat being yelled at, one of the best ways that you can get out of that, the most efficient ways to get out of that, is by moving the attention to someone else. So sometimes I'll just make it up and say something has happened. So part of that is it creates this kind of like panopticon effect, where people feel as if they're always being watched or could always be watched. And then they kind of learn to self-regulate the behavior out of fear of punishment. The other effect that this has is it isolates people from each other, and it sows distrust within the community. So it's harder for people to say collectively resist. There have been some instances where there have been riots. The other component is a privilege level system, sometimes known as a token economy. So rights have to be earned, and these can be taken away. So you would start off, say, at level 0, and if you're compliant, and compliant means both following rules and being seen to be like emotionally committed to the program, then you can move up. And the further you move up, the more access to privileges you have, what they call privileges anyway. Sometimes these are like really basic things like a phone call to your parents. It can mean like, it really depends on the program. Some are more extreme than others. But there are some where like you have to have privileges to sleep in a proper bed. So it can be like that extreme. For others, it's like you get to watch a movie, or you get to go with a group to get ice cream, that sort of things. And then once you become a higher level student, you take on like this staff-like role. So you become one of the people who enforces the program rules. And a lot of times program graduates end up working for these facilities. Some open their own. And in order to graduate, students have to reach that top privilege level. It's not just an academic requirement to graduate, it's also being shown to like be committed and reformed. So it's basically, it's coerced or forced compliance. Staff can regulate compliance using terms like healthy. So you have to adhere to the rules of the system if you want to be seen as being well. And if you resist, then that's considered to be pathological. So the program staff establish themselves as these benevolent professionals with the expert insight. And young people are treated as crazy, as liars, or as lacking insight, unless they agree with the program, in which case they're making progress, so to speak. So young people can become stuck inside these programs and internalize the institutional messaging, or learn to like play the system in plain belief. As I said, this break you down and build you back up. And that's not just my theory, they actually, some programs will quite openly say that. So one of the ways that I've been looking at this is through a lens of epistemic injustice. And by that, I mean when a person has had their capacity as a knower denied, undervalued, or undermined. So troubled teens are seen as lacking insight into themselves, and adults in position of authority have the power to determine what their best interests are. I consider this to be quite foundational to the context of understanding institutional child abuse in the troubled teen industry. There's this system-wide rejection of the young people's capacity to know themselves and what is in their interest, what they want to do, who they are. So I'm going to try to be quick because I do want some discussion time. But one of the chapters that I wrote was about conversion therapy. I touched on it before. but people are punished sometimes. Not all facilities are like that, I should preface. There are facilities where being LGBTQ is more acceptable. Some of them will have LGBTQ staff. Some of that has gotten better over time. But others have and continue to punish LGBTQ people for being out. And they have to be seen to be appropriately feminine or masculine. And so they can sometimes be assigned like physical labor. For example, if they're a man, to like toughen up, so to speak. And there's all sorts of, I'm gonna rush there, I'm sorry, because I do want to get to some discussion. But there's all sorts of like bullying and horrific stuff that can happen here. Do interrupt me if you have any questions though. I've written a journal article if anyone's interested in knowing more about the conversion therapy experiences within the troubled teen industry and some of my theory around it. There's 2 case studies that I've written about. One that I refer to as overt conversion therapy and the other as covert. So the overt one is more relating to psychotherapeutic uncover these kind of issues, but it was relatively open that there was action, whereas the other person, it was framed within a sex addiction framework. So basically saying that the more covert one doesn't openly say that it's wrong to be LGBTQ, but what it is implying in the way that its practices are carried out is that to be cisgender and heterosexual are the only right and healed way to be. And I can send these slides out if people are interested. And they've also interpreted conversion therapy as a form of epistemic violence, in that it undermines people's self-knowledge as a person who experiences same-gender attraction or who transgresses normative gender roles. And I'm happy to talk about this more. And then in terms of advocacy and resistance, just talk on this briefly. So as I mentioned, Paris Hilton's documentary, there's now a massive uptick in awareness about the industry. When I started, literally no one knew what I was talking about. And now I can be at a cafe and someone asks me what I'm doing, and they're like, oh yeah, I've heard about that. So a lot of people still don't know, but it's become more of a thing. And importantly, the press are really taking survivor stories seriously now, whereas in the past they were often depicted as being like vengeful. They were critical of the industry. And increasingly programs are being shut down. So there's these survivor advocacy groups, particularly Silence is the big one at the moment, that have been doing a lot of campaign work. There's a newly proposed Stop Child Abuse and Residential Treatment Act. I have to say, in some ways, it's pretty weak. It's really, it's kind of like shamefully basic, but that's kind of like what people feel able to ask for at this point in time. So it's really just like independent inspections should happen. There should be somebody monitoring this. So quite things that you would expect to already have been in place. The media coverage has helped to expose abuse, counter deceptive marketing, and pressure politicians to shut down abusive programs. This is a picture of one student who died in Utah in December. She was a Native American young woman who was denied medical care in quite a serious and what should have been obvious way. She'd been vomiting, I think, for a couple of days and wasn't taken to see a professional. But this is one of the first instances where I've heard of Utah shutting down a program. In the past, the kind of like media coverage would mean parents might withdraw their children and they would lose their financial support. But this is one of the first times where the state itself has demanded it be closed. And then I wanted to talk to you a bit about what is happening in Canada, or what might be, but we don't really know a lot about it. So in my research, there were Canadians. I think there were like 5 or 6 Canadians in my research. One person who I interviewed who were sent to US programs. So for example, one person who I interviewed, she was told that she was going to a place for the weekend for an evaluation, didn't know she was going abroad, and then was taken over the border and was put in a facility for over a year. And this does happen. And there are rare, but it can happen, instances of this like authorized kidnapping, which can go across borders. It's not properly regulated because people don't really know what's happening. And my guess is that it's more likely, it's more common than we think it is. Because nobody's really looking into it. I'm not aware of anybody researching this particular topic. And Canadians are by far the largest group of international students that go to these programs. But there are also programs in Canada, which again, I'm not aware of there being research on. So this is an example of one of them. It's located in Alberta and Ontario. And I wanted to see if you all will humor me with this. If you have a cell phone or a laptop or anything, if you would type in this and fill out the test as if you were a parent with, you know, you're stressed, your teenager's rebellious, and you're finding it difficult to cope. But importantly, I want you to fill it in with the idea that your child, your hypothetical child, is not using drugs or alcohol, is not violent or aggressive, is not self-harming, and is not suicidal. And then I've got this like kind of like fake email address that like disappears at the end of the day, because you have to enter an email in order to progress through. I will hopefully be able to show this to you all as well. Okay. So you can see this? Yes. It's a bit small. It's a bit small.
Sarah, I'm really sorry. I actually have another appointment, so I have to leave, but I just wanted to say thank you. I really enjoyed your presentation. And one of the things I was hoping to make is I guess more of a comment than a question, and I guess most of us probably, if you've been following any local news, you've probably heard of this, but in the province, there's been a lot of fentanyl related deaths over the last months. So there is a group of parents who are small but gaining some traction, and you know, I guess a lot of it driven by grief, you know, and frustration with traditional systems and helpers and that type of thing. But I guess really concerning in that space of like looking at things like around mandated treatment, right? So you know, I guess a lot of your presentation made me think about, you know, I guess some of the relevance here in the Newfoundland and Labrador context, right, in ways that we may not always think about.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really
Thank you.
Okay, so apologies if that's a bit small. Try to read it out. So is your child's behavior affecting your work? We'll just say yes to that one. Are they affecting your marriage? Say yeah. What do you think? Disruptive to your family life? Yeah. Okay. Being witnessed by their behavior being witnessed by other people in the home. Doesn't say what behavior. Sure. Have your parenting strategies been ineffective in dealing with your child? Should we say yes or no?
Likely, yes. You're down this road.
That's true. You're not just looking at it for no reason.
That's right.
As a parent, have you had to compromise your parenting values just to get some temporary peace in the family home? Yes. Okay. Does your child disregard you and the family expectations? Yeah. Does your child resist engaging in family events and activities? Probably a rebellious young person would here. Are they struggling in school? College? We can say no to some of these. Skipping class? Say no to eat one? Easy no. Is the school reporting disruptive behaviors? No. Have their grades been dropping? Yes. Have they been suspended or expelled from school? Does your child seem extremely peer oriented? Does your child's circle of friends consist of youth who seem to make poor choices?
Yes.
Has your child taken on an image or persona that is promoted or perpetuated by peer culture?
Yes.
I don't know how it couldn't be. Does your child put peers first over family?
Yes.
Okay. Does your child demonstrate a general lack of motivation? Has your child become more secretive?
Yes.
Okay, we're gonna say that they're not using drugs or alcohol. Do they use more than you know about? I don't know how you would know that you don't know about it. Do you think your child has a serious problem with drugs or alcohol? No. Does your child come home late or completely disregard curfew? Should we say no? No. Has your child run away or stayed out overnight without your permission?
No.
Does your child spend an inordinate amount of time on video games, the internet, or texting?
Yes.
Is your child secretive about their activities online?
Yes.
Yes.
Does your child get angry when you ask them to reduce their time spent online?
Yes.
Has your child ever been bullied or engaged in bullying while texting on their phone? Yeah?
Yeah.
Has your child ever been upset or angry after being on the internet or texting with friends? Has your child ever compromised or lied about him or herself online? Say no? Yes? Yeah, yeah, yes? No?
Because if they're secretive, we don't really know. Actually, that's
Very true. Has your child demonstrated verbally aggressive behavior?
Yes.
Say yes.
That's impersonal.
Has your child ever demonstrated physically aggressive behavior? We're going to say no. Does your child demonstrate anger and aggression or intimidation and manipulation? We're going to say no. Has your child ever threatened to harm him or herself? We're going to say no. Have they actually deliberately done this? We can say no. Say no to threatened suicide. Have you ever tried to get an assessment but been unable to access a proper assessment? Yes. Yes. Okay. Have your attempts to access local help for your child or family been ineffective?
Yes.
Has local counseling or programming been ineffective?
Yes.
Have you received a variety of different opinions from a variety of people?
Well, exactly. It has been.
No. Some information you have received from teachers, counselors, or others in the community just not made sense to you?
Yes. Yes.
Does it seem like you are the only ones as parents that consider the problem to be serious? Yes. Do you think your child needs help?
Yes. Wouldn't be filling out the form otherwise.
Yeah, exactly. Now I can't remember that email address now. I'll just make one up. They don't actually send an email. Oh, there's a problem. There. Okay, I think I didn't take that one. Hopefully this will go through now. this time.
What does it usually do?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't know why they did that. So I filled it in pretty similarly, and this is what I got.
No.
Yeah.
Extreme.
Severity rating extreme. And that was when I said specifically that they weren't using drugs or alcohol, they weren't aggressive, and that they had no self-harm. So it's unfortunate that didn't work because I was really interested to see how far you could push it where it would still say that the situation was extreme. But maybe try it later and see if it starts working again. I don't know if that was just a problem with the link. I didn't realize that.
You're on them.
The other thing I wanted to mention is something called Teen Challenge. Has anyone heard of Teen Challenge? Yeah. So there is a Teen Challenge just outside St. John's. It's only for people who are 18 years and older. So it's not a troubled teen industry in the kind of like traditional sense of it. But its origins are in the troubled teen industry as a faith-based program. So they're evangelical. The one in Canada is technically now independent from the one in the US. But they share the same kind of ideological positioning. And in the US, there's like decades of abuse allegations, including conversion therapy. And you can see that they're expanding throughout Canada at the moment. And it says here that there are 180 people, I believe, in it, or beds available. And when I went on their website, you can see I do a lot of these things going on websites and seeing what's up. I think it's actually quite telling. There's an application open for their center in St. John's, and it does not require any professional qualifications. The only thing that it asks for in the text box is for faith-based positions, and I think that they called it a faith portfolio. So this is a 12-month residential drug and alcohol rehab center. That is requiring that you have a strong faith base and not necessarily a professional qualification. I could go into it more, but the website is all kinds of red flags. I'd be interested to talk to you all about it. But yeah, one of the things that I would be really interested in is doing more research about the situation in Canada, what the scale of the industry is here. I do believe it is significantly smaller than the US, but it is here. And I would be interested to know more about what kind of like forms it takes here, how different that is, and particularly in relation to how that is influenced by the law and social policy context. So I think that has really important implications both for Canada and the US. Yeah, and I'm just interested to hear about the experiences of service users and survivors who are here. So I think I've run out of time. I apologize for that. Thank you for those who are able to stick with me, and for everyone who's attended. For anyone who has the time and wants to chat more, I'd be really happy to have a discussion. I'm genuinely really interested in what your thoughts are, what you've observed in Canada and in Newfoundland. Thank you.
We're at 1:25, we don't have people to leave, but we're waiting to get pizza in anyways. Excellent.
Just put a message on chat, so if anybody has any questions.
Okay, great. Thanks all for everyone takers.
Thank you for that presentation, Sarah. I have a lot of questions. It was really interesting. Talked about multiple layers of violence. And I guess one of the questions that I have, and maybe this is something we can talk about over lunch or because they're big questions, is how do you tackle this?
the question. I think there's a lot of different ways of looking at it. My optimistic take on it would be that I think we are in a different place than we were even just 3 or 4 years ago. A lot more public awareness. And I think the more that parents become aware of what's going on inside of these programs, and presuming that most parents are, what you might call good parents who aren't looking for their children to be subject to these really horrible experiences, this is a profit motivated industry. So if you can undercut the profit, you're going to be closing down programs. So that's one thing. The second is you need community support, right? People aren't generally looking to spend $100,000 if they don't need to. So, and a lot of people obviously can't afford to anyway. So what we really need is for people to be able to access support at much earlier stages that meets the needs of those people. And potentially that has more long-term support options. Because I think one of the issues we have now is in a lot of places, if your child did need like intensive care, which some of these young people do, you can only get it for a really limited time period. And in the US, it's also subject to insurance companies. So if your insurance runs out, you're pretty much out. So that's one of the issues. Slightly more pessimistically, I don't think you can abolish the troubled teen industry and completely shut it down. I think that it's shown that it's pretty adaptive and resilient. And I think you can abolish what is known as the troubled teen industry, but that it would probably come back rebranded as like wellness retreats or something like that. Whatever the market kind of needs are. And as long as there is a need, and there will always be a need to support young people who are kind of beyond the capacity and the cope of their parents, there's a market. So they're going to find it. And particularly, there are a number of politicians who have had financial ties to the industry, and they're not looking to close this down. One of the comparisons I make is to like the National Rifle Association. Like we have, it's nowhere near that scale. But we have all the research and data. Like we understand that America's current gun policy is highly destructive. Like we have mass shootings on a regular basis, and sometimes they're not even reported anymore, barely reported. We can't completely stop that, but there are some real practical steps that can be taken. For example, like in Scotland, we don't have that anymore. That's because of gun policy. But we're not doing that. And a lot of that is because of the power of the lobbying industry. And again, the troubled teen industry is nowhere near that scale, but I think there is a similar problem of invested interest there. So I can see it as mitigating rather than completely stopping. Yeah.
I wonder also too, you were presenting, one of the things that keep coming to mind for me is the notion of therapeutic boarding school. And I wonder to what degree the separation of those two constructs would actually be helpful to, again, trying to address some of the challenges that you've been alluding to. I grew up in Nigeria and I went to military boarding school. And I mean, there are some disciplinary matters that arose and, came to the forefront, and they kind of aligned to some of the stuff that you're talking about. But I think for many parents who send their kids to those institutions, there are various reasons why they did, right? And I guess the point that I'm trying to figure out is because for me, those two notions of therapy, but also behavior, I think that they're conflating. And I think that on some level, there might be ways in which some, people that go to those settings actually come out for the better.
Yeah.
And I think you've already alluded to that as well, that some of the people that you spoke to said as much. And I can also see the problematic aspect of people that go in and then they've been subjected to some of the violence that you also articulated. And I think if we were to manage in separating those two things, where the therapy piece of it then becomes under the auspices of institutions like the government, as an example, so that they can actually oversee some of that. There could be a bit of accountability that comes into that. That might be a way to address some of that stuff, right? But I'm wondering though, maybe you're the expert in this area, so you can maybe help me understand, maybe, is there anything that could be worthwhile investigating in terms of separating those two things? If it is therapy that majority of these institutions are doing, then that could be addressed. If it is more behavioral stuff that they're actually dealing with because kids are coming there because of parents have identified having all these behavioral issues, is that what they're mostly dealing with? And does that require a different level of intervention?
Yeah, great question. Yeah, I think the idea on paper of a therapeutic boarding school is actually not necessarily a bad one. Like the idea of young people being in a place where there's like, I think this is what I thought when I originally went to it. I was, cause I went like voluntarily. I was like, okay, it might be good to like be in a boarding school where we have therapy. But that's not what this is. And so there are people who go into programs and have found good experiences. And I talked to a couple of people who went into a program that was really horrific and then went to another one afterwards that was all right. And also I think one of the things that I try to take into account is that some people are coming from really abusive homes. So one of the person whose example was about overt conversion therapy, things that he said in the interview is that it was better than home. So in light of that, it's quite difficult, isn't it? Some like we kind of presume like, oh well, there's all this institutional violence and that's the issue, but there's also the violence in the home and in the community. So there's not an easy answer. One of the red flags for me with therapeutic boarding schools is there's this one size fits all approach. And I think that's going to be a problem no matter what you do. And to take that approach is not, I would consider to be like an actual therapeutic process. It's to like force people to abide in a particular way and to fit a particular kind of like therapeutic recovery narrative. But yeah, I mean, there are people who are doing work to try to reform the programs. That's not my approach to it. But I think that there may be some programs that today are less bad. And there is a difficulty that, like, I think just the structure of a residential program, especially one that's in an isolated space, is gonna have abusive power dynamics. And I think even a school that's set up to be a good school that is like supportive, you've got a situation where young people are extremely vulnerable to staff who might come in who are not looking to have their best interests and are abusive, and they can exploit that system very easily. And that for me is also one of the major concerns about the industry.
The behavior aspect of it. And I'm wondering, you feel like this, the viewpoints of young people. They consider some of the behaviors that they manifest, which will lead, like what we have just done, which will lead to their being admitted into, if they consider some of those behaviors as actually necessitating their being there within those institutions, maybe as part of your teacher.
Yeah, as in like, do young people agree that they need to be sent to? Yeah, I think it's mixed. Some people do. Some people don't. Some people are pretty like wild and rebellious and they don't want to be reined in. I think sometimes people are kind of this more low-level rebellion where they probably, you know, I would say quite rightly, don't feel that they had a need to intensive intervention. Other times people do agree to go and feel a need to go.
but often that's coming from a place where they're not really informed. And the problem is that once you're in, it's very difficult to get out, even if it's a supposedly voluntary program. And that's kind of like a more complex thing that takes a bit of a longer response. Happy to chat about it more at some point.
Can I just, I have a thought, so I just want to say one thing, I just want to, so, it's interesting, because you use the word informed, which I agree, they're not informed, right? But also, I have a mysterious evangelical past that I don't think I've ever declared in this room or with these people, right? And so, with these people, sorry. But it's interesting because having come from that background, I felt you have an internalized sense of shame and of not being good enough, right? That's the whole structure. And I'm respectful of people who are members of evangelical communities. I can only speak to my own experience, right? So it's not, for me, it wasn't about being informed. I didn't go to a school, but I might as well have in terms of my journey through a particular part of my life. It was about feeling like I wasn't measuring up and needing a place to fit and being given very clear guidelines as to what was acceptable and unacceptable. And you know, it goes to so many things. It goes to attachment issues. You know, it goes to all these binaries of good and bad, which is like fundamental, you know, when in evangelical circles, right? So anyway, I'll let these guys ask questions, but I'm fine with some. For me, it's just so interesting on so many different levels.
Yeah.
Having been complicit in group homes, not the type you're speaking of, as a manager for years, right? Like it's just so interesting. So I really appreciate this. Thank you.
Yeah, I'm really happy to chat with you about it.
That'd be great. Yeah, I have to go teach, but maybe hours.
Yeah, that sounds good.
Thanks.
If you were next.
Yeah.
If you're under a time constraint, I would defer to you because I have space. And then I'll
be quick. I'll be quick.
okay,
All right.
please.
So, a few decades ago, I did research, ethnographic research in a child and adolescent mental health system run by the state, run by the NHS in England. And I was thinking, as you were talking, that I came across a little bit of some of what you were talking about when you talked about the peer attack and the peer surveillance. And at the time that I was witnessing this, I was calling it peer discipline. I wasn't really sure what I was seeing. Well, I knew what I was seeing. I couldn't find anything in the academic literature, not even in Goffman, a little bit in Goffman, but not enough to really put your finger on the ways in which the children and the patients themselves were used as, and it was called a therapeutic tool. So they were used as therapeutic tools to put other kids in line so that they're behaving in appropriate, healthy ways. And so I guess I'm bringing this out because I had a bit of a flashback over it when you were talking about this, but I guess what I want to just comment on is that this troubled teen industry and its privateness and its relation to capitalism and privilege terrifies me. The idea of being kids being kidnapped in the middle of the night from their beds and being brought to these places terrifies me. At the same time as my thinking that there are elements, not as extreme, but elements of this in our public system that exists right now. And that's very troubling. Just, yeah, I think that's a great point. There are elements of this which are various kinds of programs. I mean, I would be happy to chat a bit more about like the history of it, but some of the kind of like we often call attack therapy actually originates from like the therapeutic community movement in the US. So I don't know if you've ever heard of something called Synanon. So it was an alternative drug treatment facility that was run by somebody who had a heroin addiction and had recovered from it.
and opened this program as an alternative to rehab. It was for adults originally anyway. But he kind of like really honed in on this idea of peer accountability and this kind of like shame-based peer group. That's kind of where some of the early origins of that, at least from one particular lineage, and the therapeutic boarding schools that came out starting in the 70s. And there's some the faith-based, like evangelical ones have a slightly different history, but some of the kind of like more mainstream ones are directly related to it. And somebody who had been in Synanon opened the first therapeutic boarding school. The person who ran the therapeutic boarding school that I went to was in a therapeutic community for substance misuse, which was opened by somebody who was a Synanon graduate.
So my seeing this 3 decades ago in England raises the question of how is it that this American-born concept has traveled around through time and space in ways that are harmful and hurtful to your kids and to all of us.
Yeah. Well, I think at the time, a lot of people championed it as like this great gospel alternative to medicalization. So actually, it raises really interesting stuff in terms of med studies. Because this is supposed to be the kind of like community-based alternative. And it's kind of like morphed into this like kind of monster in a way.
Thank you.
Yeah, more comment and a contribution to this thread of conversation. First of all, I'm Julia Sarah. I didn't get a chance to meet you and meet Kate. I would just want to start by appreciating your presentation. Yes. Like Bren, I want to share, while realizing it's qualitatively different, not 3 decades ago, but in this time and space through my personal and professional networks. I know of at least 3 nonprofits that are run in a combination of parent pay and subsidized, so with alleged oversight. And we all know what oversight looks like through COVID and long-term care, that are using these tactics, including peer assault. Yes, so it's alive and well in this national context, and across a couple of provinces that I'm aware of. And so I have deep concerns about how it will underground, how much it's erased under the allegation that there is provincial oversight. So I would like to talk to you a bit more
Very interested to talk
about those experiences and those institutions.
Yes.
And I can make them transparent.
Yeah. Yeah, I would love to talk more about some of my concern, and you do see some of that in the US. One of my concerns, and it kind of relates also back to like conversion therapy as an example, is that weak legislation can be quite dangerous because people put faith that there is accountability in a system where there might not be any. So whereas this is quite an obvious red flag, like there's no independent inspection. But are inspections any good if they're very staged and not very comprehensive, and it's done by a trade association where the people are friends with the person who runs the schools? So yeah, I think legislative reform is important, and I do support the people who are making these efforts in relation to the troubled teen industry. It's not necessarily where I would put my emphasis because of that concern that it can erase what's actually happening. Unless you had really effective, well, even with really effective legislation, these things can still happen. But it's very difficult to achieve. It's kind of difficult to know exactly what would be effective in these kind of like hidden spaces.
Yeah. Thank you so much.
We have
Oh,
that's right. We are
15
occupying
minutes
it.
is the next class is in 15.
Yeah.
No, it's fine, just I can hear them at the door.
yes.
I'm sure they're okay, but I guess we can